Welcome back, friends, to another architectural photography photo editing tutorial, and in this one I'm going to be walking you through my complete process. Let me show you how I take these two architectural photos, edit them in Lightroom so we can blend them together, and then use Photoshop to create a finished piece to send back to my client. So this was the first frame that I captured of this really cool property high up on the hill, and you've got this amazing view beyond, and I framed it because I actually wanted to capture the sun in the shot as well. I took a bracketed series where I was also blocking the sun as well, because if you see in the original shots we're getting a little bit of flare going on where the light is obviously bleeding into the lens, and if we cover the sun up we get a much cleaner shot. However, I wasn't particularly happy with the composition because the garage section here is just blocking the front door, so I just reframed slightly and moved myself around. So here we have the building along with one of the key features, which was this amazing panel of glasswork here along the front. We've got the sun, so it's a nice composition where the sun leads us down the pathway, the drive towards the home, and we can also see the view off into the distance. And so this is the series that I'm going to work with, and just like the last shot, because I'm including the sun in my image, we can see that we're getting a bit of lens flaring going on, so we're not getting the cleanest shot on the actual property itself. And so I used my fingers just to block the sun off with the intention of combining the two different shots. These images were shot as part of a bracketed set of 5, which is what I usually do. For some reason the 5th image has actually disappeared, but that's okay. I'm just going to use one of each of these. So I need a nice representative shot for the sky, and I also need a nice representative shot of the building. I have done a little bit of pre-processing on these just because when I import my photos they always have a preset applied to them just to give me a bit of a kickstarter. So I'm just going to reset that literally so we can start from the beginning and build this up from scratch. I've got my highlight clipping warning on, which you can see denoted by this little triangle here, and we can just press J to get rid of that if we want that gone. Although one set of images is shot with my fingers in the corner of the frame blocking the sun and the other one doesn't have that, I know that effectively they are all shot in the same position off of a tripod, and so any changes I make to one image I can make to this whole set, this whole sequence through here. And so I'm going to make sure that auto sync is turned on so that all of those changes that I decide to make to my image propagate to the whole series. One of the first things I like to do is make sure that we have remove chromatic aberration and the enable profile corrections is turned on as well. Another super important thing for doing architectural work is to make sure that you get your verticals nice and true. So I like to do that with the guided option just because it gives us a little bit more accuracy over the automatic options. So I'm going to make sure that I have a little bit of sharpening applied. I know that for my particular lens about a 1.5 radius is normally pretty good, and I don't know, somewhere around that sort of 80 mark is also pretty good as well. Depending on your lens's sharpness and also the sensor size that you're shooting on will determine the best sharpening for you. I like to use a camera flat profile just because it gives us just a little bit more dynamic range to work with, and a usual step for me will be reducing my highlights and boosting my shadows. A little bit of whites and blacks is also pretty good. I'll normally put in a little bit of clarity and sometimes just a small smidge, about +6 of dehaze. I think I'm going to add just a little bit of vibrance and saturation. Now for me this is one of those pictures where I don't necessarily need to be an absolute stickler for reality. I want this image to be imbued with a feeling, and the feeling I want is warmth from that lovely sunset. And so I'm going to grab the temperature slider and just have a little tweak of that, and I'm probably going to warm it up more than would be visually accurate, but that is the kind of vibe that I'm going to go for in this particular photo. And now I'm going to press N on my keyboard so that I can see all of those photos all displayed together. And that's going to allow me to select my favorite image to work with for the sky that includes the sun, and then my favorite components for the actual building itself. So if we focus on the shot with the sky first of all, I think we've got a little bit of an issue here, and that is that the darkest exposure is definitely the best one for the detail around the sun. We're not really blowing out the highlights there, but everything else, the shadow areas, they're completely gone. We've lost all the information there, and so that's not ideal from that perspective. But if we go to one of the brighter shots where we can see the building, you can see that we are bleaching out around the sun, and I really don't want to do that because I've gone to a lot of effort to actually try and maintain detail in the sky. And so I think the best option for us at the moment is to actually use Lightroom's merge to HDR feature. So I'm going to select all 4 of those and go photo merge HDR. I'm not going to worry about auto settings. I'm also not going to worry about auto aligning the image either. I'm normally pretty good at not bumping my tripod, so hopefully they should align nicely. And now I'm just going to borrow the settings that we had for this image and apply them to the HDR one. So I've selected both of them. I'm now going to turn off auto sync and I'm just going to synchronize the settings, and I'm making sure that everything is ticked. I'm not worried about masking because I haven't done any masking yet, and I'll just click synchronize. Now we have a DNG file here that we can work with that has the full dynamic range available to us, so we can grab the exposure slider and just move that around without actually losing any detail. So that's really nice. So I'm just going to boost up the exposure to a point where it overall looks pretty good, and then I can just come in and start to actually tweak things like my highlights, my white point, just so I'm not losing detail there. And probably just boost up the shadows as well, just so that we can blend this more seamlessly into our finished version of the homestead where I've actually blocked the sun out. One thing I often like to do with a sky is just drop down a gradient just to darken the very top of the sky. So I'm just going to do that quickly. I'm going to click and drag down just so it sort of tapers off towards the horizon line there. And now I can just grab the exposure slider and start to tweak that a little bit. And I can also create a new mask just to drop over the sun here, just to try and refine that area through there. I'm going to make sure that it's nicely feathered off, so I'm going to increase that up to 80. And maybe we want to add in a little bit of warmth in there as well, so I'm grabbing the temperature slider and just boosting that up a little bit. Okay, let's have a little toggle of with and without our masks. Here's our before, here's our after, before and after. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that image to use for the sky and some of the foreground here as well. Now we just need to work on our building image. So if I select the first one, have a look at that. It's probably a little underexposed. Maybe we want a brighter one, something like that for the actual building, maybe better. But I think what I'm going to do, the same as I did for the actual sky image, just to make sure that we have maximum quality, is I'm going to select all of them, come to Photo Merge, HDR. Leave the settings as they are there, that's all good. Click merge. And now I'm going to borrow the settings from the previously edited HDR image here and paste those over this newly created HDR. So I've highlighted both of them, and the initial HDR we created here is the selected one. And so when I go to sync and synchronize all of this information, it will take from our original one, being the selected one, and paste it over the top of that. So let's do that. Hit synchronize. And although it doesn't look like that's what we want, it is what we want. We just need to reset the exposure here, and that will probably get us a lot closer to what we're after. So yeah, that's looking pretty good. Now just need to make a couple of changes just to fine tune this. I think I'll boost up the clarity in this one just a little bit. And my main concern is making sure that the building is looking good. I can just eyeball my histogram and make sure that I have a full tonal range available to me, which I do. And if I click N on the keyboard again, we're going to get a side-by-side comparison, so we can just check that these two images are going to work well together, which I think they are. So we're going to go edit in, and we're going to open as layers in Photoshop. So now we have our two layers, one on top of the other. We have our image that's going to represent the sky, maybe some of the foreground as well. And then we have this image, which has a much cleaner looking building. Even some of the foreground here looks a little bit more punchy as well. And so we need to seamlessly merge these two elements together. And so what I want to do is work on this layer for a start and get rid of my funny little claw fingers here that were blocking the sun. So super easy to do. I'm just going to come in and I'm going to drag a selection around that. And I'm going to move this over here just to steal from the sky and see what that does. Yep, that's good enough for the purposes of making a selection. So now using this layer, I'm going to create a mask which is going to introduce our sky for us. And I'm not going to do it the way you might think, just coming in and coming up to select sky, because you can do that, but it's not actually going to be a particularly accurate mask. If I was to use that mask that Photoshop's created, put that over the top of this one and then bring it in, you can see it's okay, but it doesn't have the nuances of allowing us to bring in the details from this layer, say over the leaves where they're getting a little bit overexposed, or even on this little bit of highlighted wall here. I would like to actually be able to steal from the darker layer that we used for the sky and bring that in over that bit as well. And so I'm just going to delete that mask and I'll show you a much better way. I'm going to be using a tool called 𝗨𝗻𝗄𝗄𝗆. I've covered this tool so many times in my tutorials, so I'm not really going to go over it here in this video, but basically it allows us to select a mask based on the luminosity values in our photo, i.e. the brightness or the darkness of the pixels. Currently I'm making my selection based on our darker layer, but I don't want to do that. I actually want to hide that and use the brighter underlying layer that's going to allow me to make a selection with all of this lovely interesting detail between the darks and the highlights and all the grey pixels that allow us to get that lovely variance between transparency of being visible or not. And so now we have that preview of the mask. If we're happy with how it looks, and if you're not, you can fine tune it by moving this slider here to make a more punchy high contrast mask, or you can move it all the way to the top and you're going to have a very soft, more transitional mask. But the ideal is somewhere around here where you have the pure black pixels, pure white pixels, and you have some grey pixels for the midtones in between. Once you're happy with that, just make sure that you select the layer that you want that applied to and click mask, and we'll just hide 𝗨𝗻𝗄𝗃. And as I show the layer, there you go, you can see just how precisely we've been able to bring in this layer to interact with the one underneath. If you're into architectural photography, this honestly is a real game changer. So if we zoom in here and I just show a little before and after, I mean, look at all the detail being reintroduced around the hedges here, around the top of the trees. You know, it's so much better. It's a much cleaner image once we reintroduce that. So I'll hold the Alt key and click on that layer mask, and now I can see the mask that's being applied. And if I want to just fine tune this, which I do, I will do. So a good way with working with masks is actually to use the dodge and burn tool in the highlights mode. I'm not going to have that exposure set to 100, maybe 33% will be quite nice. And now I can click and start painting over the sky. And now, because I've pushed that mask to pure white, we know that that sky is being fully reintroduced, but we also have the benefit of these transitional pixels that just allow it to blend in more seamlessly. And while I like what that mask's doing through most of the picture, I feel like it's just starting to dull down our home. If we look at the before and the after, it's just muddying up those pixels a little bit in the home. So what I'm going to do is just do the double masking technique, which involves adding a group, drop our layer that contains this information into this group, and now I can add a new mask to that group. And what that's going to allow me to do is just roughly come in and remove this effect where I don't want it. So I'm going to go to the brush, switch to black. I'm currently at 50% opacity, and that's probably fine. And just to make sure that I'm not painting into the sky here, I'm just going to do a quick selection around the house. And now as I toggle this group off and on, you can see that we've got the best of both worlds. We've got all of the highlights controlled in the sky, we've got it controlled in the foliage and on the driveway as well, but the house itself isn't affected. We've still got that much more punchy and vibrant version that we created in that underlying layer. In any architectural photo that I'm editing, once I've created the version that contains all the dynamic range I need, and so we have all of the tones, the shadows, everything there, I will do a stamped visible layer, and now is the time that I'll actually come in and start cleaning up the photo. So I will be looking for anomalies or things that catch my eye, such as this leaf and this little mark on the driveway here, a little bit of bark that's on there. I think there's a reflection of a lamppost in one of these panels of glass here, so that needs fixing up. Just little things that catch the eye that aren't going to be missed if you remove them from the photo. And so I use a mixture of the cloning brush tool, the patch tool, basically any technique that is just going to get the job done as quickly as possible. So at the moment I'm just pressing Alt to sample from an area. So what I'm going to do is hold the Alt key here, and I'm going to sample from this little bit of the block here. I can just paint that over the top of that there. Looks like there's just a little bit more staining on the concrete here, so I'll sample from a similar area. How detailed you decide to go on this is entirely up to you, and it's often sort of driven by how large the client is going to want to actually view the work. Like if it's for their website only, then you don't really need to go too nuts. Like for example, there's this tiny little leaf here which I probably not normally retouch. I may not. Like if this is being blown up large for a magazine, then absolutely yes, I'm going to retouch it. But if it's just for a website, I'm not going to worry too much. So here, this is something that you need to do quite often, is to steal from one geometrically similar place. So we have the window panel here, and I can Alt click on that and then line it up with the frame on this window, and now I can just paint straight down and borrow from the one on the right. Super easy. Even little things like these security stickers, sometimes I will go as far as just getting rid of those. So I'm borrowing from the corner of the frame edge there and just going to bring that over to this frame edge. Not entirely sure that I'm happy with the job I've done there, so I might just give that one more go, resample, And if you make your brush a little bit larger, it's a bit easier to kind of line it up with what was existing there before, and then you can always shrink it back down, and I just use the bracket keys to enable me to do that. There we go, that's probably a little bit straighter. If we look at the before and the after, it is just a little bit brighter, and you can do things to control that, but to be honest, I don't think that's noticeable, and if it's not going to be noticeable, then I don't worry about it. Now, one thing that's catching my eye over here is a reflection of the sun from some of the glass, and it's bouncing back over onto the wall, and I'm always walking that tightrope between being authentic to reality and creating an image that is pleasing to look at. And I think this is one of those instances where we can make a little mask, make a selection around this area, and just paint this out. So I'll select that panel, and now I'm just going to alt click on the wall so I can steal the same color, and I'm just going to build this up. I'm currently at 50% opacity, maybe select a slightly different color. And I don't know how well this is going to show up on your computer on YouTube, but one of the issues that I'm experiencing here is originally we had the noise from the camera, the digital noise, or maybe it's even speckling of the stones or a bit of a combo of both. But where I'm painting over, obviously it's very flat, there's no noise in that, which may not even be noticeable, but I would like to try and fix that if possible. And so a good way to do that is to grab the patch tool, and we can borrow from another flat area that already exists. So for example, the sky, because the sky is going to have digital noise in it. But watch what happens. If I just grab this and bring it up to the sky, it's not going to work because it's going to bleed around the corners, and that's not what we want. And so I need to undo that. I'm going to deselect that, and I'm just going to come in with just a little bit of a tighter crop. I could have just shrunk that selection down using the modify command in the select drop down box, but I'm just going to do this. This is going to be fine. It's going to be close enough. Patch tool, drag up to the sky where we're going to get a bit of that noise, release. And now when I zoom back in, you can see that we have the retouched version, but now we actually have that speckling effect that we had originally, and we got rid of that light flare. So we've got our before and our after. All of that light flare is now gone off the wall, as is the light there, but to be honest, I'm not too worried about keeping hold of that. That can go, and if we look on the floor, you can see a little bit of orange cast there, and there's several ways that we could fix that if we wanted, but possibly the easiest way would just be to grab our brush, come down into the color mode, and we can just steal the same color from the concrete further along and sort of paint that over the top, and that's just going to neutralize that color cast. Not perfect, but it's good enough. This garden area where we've got a lot of mud showing through, it's not that visually appealing, and I may, if I wasn't doing a video recording, actually come in and actually retouch this, introduce some of the extra grass and stuff. But I'm going to pretty much leave it as it is. The one thing that really is catching my eye though is this little irrigation pipe here, so I will just fix that up. And for that one, let's see what the spot healing brush can do for us. Usually I am a real stickler for making sure that my sensor is clean before I go out to any jobs, but unfortunately if you look in the sky you can see that it looks like I took my lens off and sneezed in there. Absolutely awful. And if you're actually struggling to see potential dust spots on your sensor, what you can do is actually create a curves layer and just go for a really crazy aggressive zigzag approach, and then all of those little dust spots really become evident. So having the layer underneath selected, which is the actual sky, obviously not the curves layer itself, once that is selected we can come in, and I find a really quick way to fix this up is just to grab the patch tool, drag a selection over a lot of the offenders, and then just release. So make a selection, drag to a clean piece of sky, release, and it's going to get rid of it for you. Super quick, super easy. And I'm also going to get rid of this cloud up in the sky here because I'm just not a big fan of that. I find it a bit visually distracting. And although the patch tool has actually introduced just a few little anomalies where the digital noise kind of clashes around the edge, I'm okay with that. As soon as we hide that curves layer, you're not even going to notice that. So let's throw that curves layer away. That served its purpose, and let's call this layer Retouch. Now, while I do like the sky in this image, I feel like it's just lacking something. I kind of feel like, what if we had a cloud that was helping to lead our eye towards the sun there? Just a little bit more visual interest. I think that would be much more interesting for this image rather than having, a third to a half of the image just a flat blue. And so I'm going to come in and see if we can't introduce a new sky. So I'm going to come up to the edit menu and I'm going to come to sky replacement. And before you start thinking, what was the point of going to all the trouble of making sure we kept that lovely sky we had before? Once I introduce this sky, I'm only going to be borrowing some of this cloud. I don't want the whole sky replaced. So I'm going to make a few adjustments to see if I can't align the cloud up with the sun. So here's the sun here. I just want to borrow a little bit of this cloud, and I don't really want this darker, ugly cloud. So let's scale it up a bit, perhaps warm it up a little bit too. Okay, something like that will do. And now I'm going to create a quick mask because all I want to do is just feather this in. So I'll use a linear gradient, a black through to transparency, and I'll drag that starting at the corner of this over here, so it will just taper in from the sun towards the cloud. The colours are certainly a little off at the moment, so let's just have a little play around and see whether moving to screen might solve the issue, which it doesn't. What about switching to soft light? No, that's not really doing it either. So what I'm going to do is move back to normal, and I'm going to actually create a new stamped visible layer based on the addition of this cloud here. So what I need to do is press Control, Shift, Alt and E, the monster shortcut, and now I'm just going to throw that sky replacement layer away. So now we have before and we have after, and I'm now going to switch this mode into difference. That is going to allow me to come to my channels and actually make a selection by pressing Control and clicking on the RGB there. And now if I come back, I'm just going to hide this, create a solid color. Let's go for white, and there you go. That is using the mask that I literally just created, but it's just a little bit tepid and the color's not quite right. So I'm holding the Alt key and clicking on the mask, and that allows me to actually see that mask. Now I can make some adjustments directly on that. So I'm going to come to Image, Adjustments, and I'm just going to use my curves just to boost up the white values here. So I'm going to drag this point on the curve over and just bring the midpoints down. Click OK. And now we can actually see some of that cloud introduced. And as I say, the color's not quite right. We're having a white cloud at the moment. So what I'm going to do is come over and sample some of this kind of yellowy tone here. Yeah, something like that's okay. Here's our before, here's our after. And I just want to introduce the cloud, nothing else. So I'm just going to do a double mask again. I could manipulate the mask that we already have, but sometimes it's easier just to create a brand new mask. So I'm holding the Alt key, clicking on the mask, and that will fill it with black. And now all I need to do is press X on my keyboard so I can access white to paint back in that cloud. I'm using my right bracket key to make my brush size a little larger, and I'm currently on 50% opacity. And that's perfect because that's just going to allow me to kind of build that effect up only where I want it. Okay, so here's our before, here's our after. Before and after. Perhaps it's just a little bit strong, so I'm just going to grab the opacity slider and just have a play with that. Yeah, just fade it back just a little bit. And if you guys want to know where I got my really useful high-res skies from, there's a sky library that I'll put a link to in the description below. It's got 300 skies in both RAW and JPEG format, and it's perfect for use with architectural and real estate work. So from here, I'm just going to make another stamped visible copy, and I'm just going to grab the underlying layers and just throw them in the bin just to keep a little bit organized. And you might be thinking that's a destructive workflow, don't really like that. And you can leave all of your layers live, but to be honest, once I've made my changes, normally I'm pretty happy and I never go back and actually make any changes. So I'm happy to do that. And now for the next step, I want to actually create a little bit of haze around the sun, some atmospheric perspective. And so all I'm going to do is just make some one-off clicks around the sun, just so it kind of looks a little bit hazy. You know, this is way too much at the moment, but it's all going to be controlled by dropping my opacity, then throwing on another layer and creating a slightly brighter color. I've currently got an orangey look. We're going to go for a brighter color and bring the size of the brush down a little bit. Do one click right over the top of the sun, then go for a pure white, another click on the sun, and there we go, another click right there. So now we've got a softer taper towards the sun. It's just a little bit easier on the eye. We can put those into a group and see our before and our after. And sometimes another little trick I like to do when I'm actually working with the sun is just to sample a color very close to there and then come in, maybe not with 50% this time, let's go for a little lower, and I'm just going to paint a dot there. Let's go again, just a little bit bigger, and we'll go one size bigger, and we'll actually make this just a little richer color as well. Again, maybe not quite 29%. Do a pass there. and another pass that way. And this time I'm just going to change the blend mode over to soft light. So here's our before, here's our after. Really subtle, but it's just warming up that area around the sun nicely, right? And this was before we added the sun haze, and this is after. And if you think, well, that's just a little bit too much, we can just come in, drop the opacity a little bit, put both of those into a group. And again, now it's fully controllable by altering that opacity. And I don't know, let's put that 2/3 of the way up, 66%. So here's our before, here's our after. Okay, let's do a little bit of color work. So I'm going to come in and add a hue saturation layer, and I'm going to try and control some of the colors individually. So I'm finding that the driveway is just a little bit too orange just here. Like for sure, it's picking up the sunlight and there'll be some reflecting off of the garage that's just out of shot, but it's just a little bit too much. So I'm going to click and drag to the left, and that's going to be pulling out some of that color. I don't want to completely desaturate it, but I just want to remove some of it. And to make sure we confine it just to that area, I'm going to use the quick selection tool, just drag it over the driveway only. And I want the opposite of that, so I'll press Control, Shift and I. So that's giving me the inverse of that mask, and now I can just press Control, Delete to fill that mask with black. So now if we look at our before and after, we're just dulling down the orange from that driveway. I'll press Control D to deselect that, and now I want to address the greens that we have over on the left hand side here. So this is just a personal preference. Sometimes I find that greens just overpower the image. I want this to be more about like the oranges and the complementary color, the blue in the sky here. I don't want the palette of green competing with it. So I'm going to come in and we're just going to again grab the little hand slider here, which allows us to click on the specific color, click and then drag to the left to desaturate it, or take it to the right to add the saturation. So I just want to desaturate this. I'll go quite heavy handed, and then I can paint this mask in only where I want it. So I'm now going to fill this mask with black, which I'm going to do by just pressing Control I, and that's going to invert the mask that we had, which was a fully white mask. So now it's become a fully black mask. I'm now going to go to the brush, and I can just paint this effect in over here. So currently we're on 17% opacity. I'm just going to crank that up to about 50%. Alternatively, you can just press 5 on your keyboard, and that will set that to 5%. And I just want to bring some of that color out. And by taking away some of the saturation from here on the left hand side in the garden area, our eye is naturally going to be drawn more towards the house. It hasn't got to compete as much with the vibrancy and saturation going on that left hand side anymore. The next thing I'd like to do is work with contrast, and normally the best way inside Photoshop to do that would be to open curves and start playing around with your curves, making some adjustments there. However, I said I was going to show you guys some of my favorite plugins and tools. So one thing that I will do, rather than working with curves in that way, like sure, you can absolutely do it with curves, but it's time consuming. So I'm going to make a stamped visible layer, and that's going to enable me to take this whole photo straight into ColorEfex Pro. So I'm going to come over to Filter, Nik Collection, and I'm going to jump into ColorEfex Pro 5. And I have various presets that I've created just to help me deal with architecture. Like for example, there's this architecture contrasty exterior. So let me quickly go through this. As I scroll through the right hand side, it probably looks quite complicated, but it really isn't. I'm just going to collapse these tools down so that you can actually see there's actually not too much going on here. There's only 4 tools that I've added, and I'm just going to turn them all off so that we can see this effect build. So first of all, the thing that I really like about ColorEfex Pro 5 rather than version 4 is it has this intensity slider. So I'm going to push this all the way to 100 so you can see how vulgar it is when you go all the way. But look, you know, a little goes a long way. I can push that to 10%, turn this off and turn it on, and it's given it a nice little enhancement. So the next thing I find really useful through this tool is Detail Extractor. I'm going to turn that on, and without the use of the other filters to balance it out, it can start to look a little bit kind of HDR like if I push that all the way to 100, it certainly looks HDR. However, a little again goes a long way, and I found that architects really like the addition of this because it does add more detail to their work. I'll be honest, it's not a great addition for this particular photo because this isn't one where we're really wanting to introduce detail, but for interiors where you've got a lot of like really nice textures going on, this is a fantastic tool to add in. But I'm just going to leave it on for this one. I also like turning on the polarization filter, particularly for outside. So if I crank the strength up so you can see what's going on, that really is adding a nice level of richness. And for this particular photo, I'm liking a stronger effect of that. So here's our before, here's our after. Let's go with that. And now let's jump into the Pro contrast. And this one, out of all of the effects, is actually my favorite. I'm going to turn that on. It may be a little bit overcooked now because we've bumped up the polarization and that new clear view effect that we have. However, I'll just bring that back down and show you what this does. The correct contrast slider, that is a little bit like adding an S-curve in Photoshop. So that's not super useful. It is good, but not super useful. I'll normally add in, I don't know, 14%. Let's go for that. But the dynamic contrast, that is actually really useful because it's making localized contrast adjustments. So I really, really dig the dynamic contrast. So we'll go for a little bit of correct contrast and a lot more of the dynamic contrast. Now I'm forgetting that I've turned these off, so by the time I put these back on, it might be just overcooking a little bit. So I'll just pull that down, and don't forget this opens up as a brand new layer, so we can always control this by dropping the opacity or mask it in specifically where we want it. So I'm going to leave it pretty heavy-handed for now. And then the fourth tool that I add, which is a bit of a weird one, you might think for architecture, but that is Glamour Glow. So here's our before, here's our after. It just creates this kind of softening to the image. And so for this one, I'm going to actually increase the glow warmth because I really want to enhance the nice warm feel of this image. Things are getting a little desaturated, so I'll just push that saturation back up, and let's just play with the saturation slider. Here's our before, here's our after. Yeah, I quite like that. Okay, let's apply that, and that's going to bring that back into Photoshop. And you can see comparatively, as this is loading it back in, just how washed out our original version was looking. But now, thanks to ColorEfex Pro, here is our before, here is our after. That is a big difference, and I really like it. So you may not want to apply it with that level of intensity, so you can always, like I say, drop the opacity down, and that might be a wise move because it is easy to overcook these kind of effects. But what I prefer to do is actually drop a mask over it and then fill it with 50% grey, and that's the equivalent of changing the opacity to a 50-50. But now I can come in with a brush with white and actually say, you know what, I want more of that effect over the sun. I want more of that effect over the building. And that just allows you to sort of control the intensity of the effect. By the same token, if you feel it's too much in certain areas, you can switch to black, which I just did by pressing X on the keyboard. So it's bringing intensity to this flower bed that I've actually done a couple of things to actually kind of reduce its impact on the image. So now we have a mask that looks like this. Super rough, super ready, but it's been able to control that ColorEfex Pro layer with more detail. And now I'm looking at it again, I'm thinking that it is sort of increasing the intensity on this cloud up here just a little bit too much. So again, I'm going to work with the black brush and just reduce it over this area. If you want to get hold of ColorEfex Pro, I've also got a link and a discount code for that in the description as well. But if you want to go for a more tried and true traditional method, of course you can come in and work with your curves traditionally in Photoshop and then come in and mask those. I just don't do it that way as much anymore just because it's more time consuming. But I could come in and just boost the contrast a little bit more on the home itself. We can come in, grab a midpoint and just darken things down, and that's just going to help enrich the contrast as well. And now I can just paint this effect in only where I want it. So I'm thinking I'm going to darken down the sky, particularly the top a little bit. So again, I'm going to invert my mask, so we're starting from a blank mask as it were, and now that's going to allow me with white just to reintroduce that effect. So I'm going to drag down from the top, and as you know, by holding shift we'll constrain the angle of the gradient to 90 degrees. And there you go, here's our before, here's our after on the sky. We may also want to use some of that to darken down the foliage here, maybe that bit of mud there as well, and perhaps even some of the driveway as well. Let's grab our gradient tool again, this time not at 100%, sort of around 50, and I'm just going to taper in from the edge here so we have a darker right hand side of the image. So let's have a look at that. Here's our before, here's our after. Before and after. So if I hold Alt and click on that mask, you can see what I've created there. So effectively, we've just created quite a controlled vignette that we've been able to add to our image. How far you go with the curves adjustments is entirely up to you. You know, you might want to brighten up some of those areas. So do the opposite of what we just did before, where we were dulling areas down. Now we're going to sort of brighten up and bring attention to areas. So I'm going to invert that mask again, allowing me to use white just to paint it in. And I might just sort of do a little streak through the middle there across the sun and the building itself. So here's our before, here's our after. If you think you've gone too far, you can adjust the mask itself, go back to black. And if I've made a series of adjustments using curves all together, what I'll do is select them all, press Ctrl G just to group them together, call it curves, and now we can see our before and after with the curves adjustment. We can see our before and after with the addition of ColorEfex Pro. And if we weren't to use that and we just used the curves, it would look something like this. But because we use ColorEfex Pro, I just think that was, yeah, look at that, before and after. It's just elevating the image. Now, I said that I wanted to imbue this image with a sense of warmth, and I still do. Currently, we've got quite a kind of clean palette, which is fairly representative of how it was when I was actually there. The blues in the sky are still blue, the greens in the foliage are still green. So what could we do? Well, there's several ways that we can color tone an image. However, for this one, what I think I might try is just overlaying it with a solid color, you know, going for like a nice warm orange, and then come into the blend mode and just switching that to soft light. Let's try overlay. Okay, I'm going to go back to soft light, double click on it, and I'm going to bring that down, because if all we want to affect is the color itself, we want to make sure that the value set here for the brightness is set to 50%, so it's not affecting the brightness in any way. And then we can go more towards a yellow, we can go more towards a red, which kind of looks more like a kind of evening-y color. You know, that is really lovely and rich. And maybe we don't want it across the whole image, but perhaps more predominant in the highlights. So to do that, we can work with our mask. I'm just going to jump into 𝗨𝗏𝗄𝗃 again, because that's the easiest way to do it. I'm going to press L, so we are going to select more so the whites. So as you know, white reveals, black conceals. So we're going to see that orange toning only where the white is, and it's going to taper off towards where the black pixels are. So I'll click mask, and now we have this orange effect added only into the highlights. Okay, I'm just going to drop the opacity of that slightly so that the intensity of that color isn't so strong. So now here's our before, here's our after. And providing you're not working to a super tight deadline, what I would recommend before you send this back to your client is just sit on it for a while. Sit on it overnight. So I think I'm done at the moment, but I'm sure that if I come back to this image tomorrow with fresh eyes, I will see new things that I don't see right now, that you possibly see just looking at the video thinking, oh, why hasn't he done that? Or the sky in the center bit, now I'm seeing it just looks a little bit too dark, and that might need sorting out. There may be other things as well. So I'd recommend saving this file out as a PSB, which will allow you to save more than 2 GB of data. And based on how many layers I've got here, it would normally exceed that. So save it, make adjustments the next day before you send it back to your client. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to call this done, and let's have a look at where we came from and where we got to. So let's have a quick review of how we got there. Okay, so as a comparison, I've brought in our original unedited files. So I've dropped these to the bottom of the stack so we can have a quick review of how we got to our finished image. So first of all, we did some Lightroom adjustments, color temperature, boosted the shadows, dropped the highlights, that sort of thing, but we were still overexposed over here. I used the patch tool to remove my fingers so that we could then use the advanced masking capabilities, the luminosity masking of 𝗨𝗏𝗄𝗃, to bring in the sky pretty much seamlessly. It's such a good way to blend differently exposed photos together. So that then gives us a really strong base to carry on our edit. From there, I did some retouching. So I removed distracting elements, which weren't too many in this particular instance, and I also added in that cloud there just to give us a bit of visual interest and help lead the eye in towards the sun. On review, I'm already thinking I could have done a much better job with that cloud. The slight discoloration that you can see there, I'm not very happy with that. But anyway, other techniques for that might be for another video. I then added a bit of haze to the sun, just with a couple of layers there. So I added a sun haze layer, which is just helping to kind of feather in the hard white ball of the sun into the sky, just softening things off nicely. And then I added a painted orange layer in soft light mode. So it's just helping to kind of add a little bit of color warmth to that. And again, just a soft, subtle glow. So here was our before, here was our after. From there, I just did a bit of color retouching, so I took out the distracting orange from the driveway there. So this was our before, this was our after. If you are doing color work and removing colors, don't remove it completely, just reduce it. I then created a stamped visible layer just so that I could bring that into ColorEfex Pro. And once I did bring it into ColorEfex Pro, bam, that's where we really started to get a nice amount of pop to the image. So I really feel like you get a big bang for your buck using that tool. And then I just did a little bit more refinement work with the curves tool. So you can use curves instead of using ColorEfex Pro. However, things like the detail enhancer, the localized contrast adjustments, it's a lot harder to actually do that manually inside of Photoshop. So for speed and efficiency, ColorEfex Pro for me for the win. And then for the final step, I just added a little bit of color toning only into the highlights. And again, I just went into Lumenzia, clicked on the L to create the highlights, and then made that into a mask. So here was our before, here was our after. Once you've got the foundations of your photo edit set and you're happy with the overall look of your image, you're free to get a little bit more creative with things like color grades. And that's exactly what I did here. I've just done a little bit of color grading. I'm not sure if I like it or not, but it just certainly adds a feeling of warmth to this image. So this is probably more likely what I would send back to my client as the licensed image, whereas this might be more likely to be something I would share on Instagram or on my website. So if you'd like to know more about how I do my color grading, this kind of process, then write color grade in the comments, and if enough of you request it, I'll put a video together on that. Do let me know if you would have done anything differently, and if you've got any hints and tips to share, by all means post them in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next architectural photography editing video.